This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek, and we've been covering the history of fascist organizing in the United States and the role of the billionaires, a section of the billionaires, to support funding for fascists. And joining us again today is Russ Bellant. He's a longtime researcher of the rise of fascism in the United States, who these forces are, what their project and plan is. So, welcome to our show, Russ.
Appreciate your hospitality, Steve. I look forward to talk.
So, Russ, before the election, we talked about how fascists had organized to bring Trump to power and organized politically. Since the election, obviously, many of the people that have a fascist ideology are now in the state apparatus. Maybe you can talk about the people who are organizing for fascism and who has come into power with the Trump administration.
Sure. I think the first person I want to identify, since a lot of people have got sized up Elon Musk, they haven't sized up Peter Hegseth that much. And Peter Hegseth, I think, is deserves a lot of attention. As he was talked about a lot before the confirmation hearings about his tattoos, about his alcoholism, and about abuse of women and so forth. But they didn't actually look at what Peter Hegseth was, what he was part of, and what he was saying on podcasts. To give some quick examples, he said on a podcast that was broadcast in November on a Christian Reconstructionist network, that's which very few people pay attention to. He said that he was organizing an underground army, and that it was being organized through a network of Christians, classical Christian schools, which were part of the Christian Reconstructionist network that he was part of. He didn't describe it that way. Those are my words. And he and the podcast hosts smilingly referred to this network of schools as the boot camp for the underground army. Well, on another broadcast, he talked about how this army was being organized for insurrection. He's part of a Christian Reconstructionist network headed by a guy named Doug Wilson. And this school network of Association of Classical Christian Schools now claims 502 schools across the country. That doesn't mean that there's massive attendance at these schools. I assume they're fairly small, but when you have 502 of them, that's a lot of young people. And they are basically made clear. He did another podcast with the head of the Christian School Network, a guy named Goodwin, and they again referred to this their school network as organizing an underground army for insurrection. That was part of the broadcast. And so when you look back at this network, that they talk about the growth of the schools rising dramatically after Peter Hegseth wrote a book, Battle for the American Mind, which basically, takes on, the conventions of education and casts the idea of education as in a Reconstructionist network, so that people believe that to make clear on Reconstructionism, they assert, and they're teaching children, their students, that secularism is not biblical, it's not acceptable, and the U.S. Constitution is a secular document that must be replaced with a theocratic model. Now, just to give an idea of not only their post-constitutional theocracy, their leader wrote a book in 1996 or so, that that put forward the concept, the notion that the lie that slavery, antebellum slavery, historical slavery in America, was a great benefit to everybody in the country, apparently including the slaves. Now, I'm not going to spend money on a book, of this sort, but Hegseth has been very explicit prior to his confirmation hearings that they were going to purge DEI from the Pentagon and critical race theory. I suspect there is no critical race theory discussions going on at the Pentagon. However, they made this claim. And so when you look into their motivation, they're really trying to promote white supremacy. After his leader, Doug Wilson, published this book, they began working with neo-Confederate white supremacists for a Reconstructionist movement of the old Confederacy, restore the white supremacy. And in the halls that they occupy, they're headquartered out of Moscow, Idaho. The halls they occupy, they have the halls lined with pictures of Confederate generals from the Civil War. So they're unmistakably, a white supremacist theocratic model that will dictate a form of mandatory biblical allegiance for everybody who's considered an American citizen. And so that's Peter Higgs.
And Hegseth has some tattoos on his body. That did come up in
Yes.
the.
Yes.
What were those tattoos, and what do they say about him?
Well, one of them has the slogan of it's a Latin phrase that was the slogan of the Crusaders of 1,000 years ago, who, crusaded against the growth of the Muslim religions and the invading force. And he just had another one put on his arm, and I'm trying to remember exactly what I said. But along with that Latin tattoo, he had machine guns tacked on, and then something that says "We the People" on his arm, and he had something tattooed on his chest that he said was Christian, but others say it's a neo-Nazi symbolism.
And do you think he wants to bring Nazis into the military?
I believe he focused on bringing white racists into the military because on one of his podcasts, he said, when we get rid of DEI, then we'll get people who want to join the military who don't want to be in a DEI army. In other words, white supremacists who don't want to be under the command of, say, a black officer or sergeant, well, probably officer and senior officer level, and or Latino or anybody else. Except he thinks that there's a pool out there of white men, and I mean men specifically, who want to join, but they don't want to be also under a command of a woman either. So he asserted that, and now they claim that since they're getting rid of DEI, that there's been a big increase of enlistment, presumably of this pool of people who were basically took a racist and sexist attitude toward the composition of the leaders in the army, which were mostly, of course, white males anyways, but they didn't want any. And he, as you know, he made that very clear by coming in early and getting rid of the commanding Joint Chiefs of Staff who was black and the commander of the U.S. Navy who was a woman. And so he's manifested his urgency to do this, and I know it's going beyond that. They even purged the U.S. Navy library out of 387 books. I think it was 387 that had titles that were, like anti-racist, or dealt with sexual orientation issues or gender issues. They purged all those books out of the library.
And he's now using the military on the border. He's militarized part of the border.
Yes, yes. And this is kind of the beginning of what even former Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall talked about, which is putting the military on the streets. And if we sanction it by first allowing it to be used for law enforcement purposes on the border, then then you're building a creeping growth of street enforcement. We have to remember that Donald Trump in 2020, or early in 2020, he ordered the Secretary of Defense to put the army on the streets of America, focused on the big cities, to start shooting George Floyd protesters. And the Secretary of Defense then, Mark Esper, said he would not issue such an order. He was absolutely emphatic that I will not issue that order. So Trump was stymied. What Peter Hegseth and Trump have done with military is they purged the JAG officers, the Judge Advocate Generals. And as Frank Kendall, the former Air Force Secretary, said, these are the people that could stop any illegal order, whether it violates the law of land warfare, the Geneva Convention, or United States law. And they can order any general or admiral to stop operations, and their orders are superior. They got rid of the JAG officers, and Kendall said that this could clear the way for putting the military back in the streets of this country.
And these prisons that they want to set up, El Salvador, the conditions in these prisons, Guantanamo, where there will be no rights against torture. They support waterboarding. They support these torture tactics.
Yeah.
They defend them and say that they're justified. Isn't that the case?
Yes, yeah. The revival of Guantanamo really speaks to that clearly, but they're also identifying more locations around the country. You saw heard the other day, I'm sure, that he wants to reactivate Alcatraz, but in Michigan, where I live, they are restoring and upgrading, or I'm not sure if upgrading is the right word. They're restoring to use an 1,800 bed prison in mid Michigan and it's being restored under the auspices of ICE, not the Federal Bureau of Prisons, but under ICE, for mass incarceration. And they're looking for all this mass incarceration capacity prior to, I think, imposing martial law. And that's another point that, again, the former Air Force Secretary talked about, Frank Kendall. He said that there are documents that go back to some of them go back to the Eisenhower years. They're all classified, but they're called Presidential Executive Action Documents, PEADs. And these documents create certain conditions where a president can do something. Now, these documents have not been reviewed by Congress. Of course, they're classified. They have not been reviewed by the Supreme Court. So a president using these is really making a decision to step out where the legality has never been tested. And I suppose they're classified because they wouldn't meet a public standard of legitimacy. So he said that he could use a PEAD as a justification for creating martial law. And Frank Kendall also is a retired general, besides being an Army general, and in addition to being that. So he's been around this world for a while in this world. So I'm trusting that he speaks pretty authoritatively on this. And so you have this pretense of legitimacy with a declaring martial law. You have mass incarceration capacity being increased. You have already the preliminary steps of using the U.S. Troops on the border. And again, we have, I think, going back to 1887, the Posse Comitatus law, which the Congress enacted and to ban the use of the military in domestically for any kind of coercive force or for law enforcement purposes. And of course, now Trump has also issued an executive order, as if this is actually law, issued an executive order, a dictate that police units must be connected up to the authority of local police units of our cities must be connected up to the federal law enforcement system, which means he's trying to take unilateral control of all the military and paramilitary and legally coercive potential power on the streets of America and put them under one command.
And in Texas, in Florida, what is another thing that maybe you can talk about in relationship to the ICE and the militarization is that they're apparently deputizing these right-wingers, these fascists and racists on the border to make them state officials in charge of rounding up people?
I felt from the beginning that these militias that were still extant. Remember, Trump said in 2024 during his campaign that if he doesn't win the election, there will be a bloodbath. Now, of course, he's prone to misstatement, exaggeration, and all sorts of untrustworthy things to not put a lot of stock into. But he obviously thought he had some capacity then in the militia movement to raise civil disturbance, at least. Then, of course, he immediately releases the militia people who were incarcerated due to January 6th. And by that, further staffs it. If you take the Hegseth Army, if you take in Florida, the retired general who was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency for Donald Trump in his first term, Michael Flynn. Michael Flynn has been running a training camp in Florida to teach young people how to become snipers. And he's obviously doing that with great indoctrination. And at this point, I'd like to actually talk about something that cuts across Trump world regarding indoctrination. There's a book that's gotten very little attention. There was an op-ed in the New York Times on it back in August, I believe it was. This book was published in July, and the book is titled Unhumans. Is one word, Unhumans. And the book's thesis, as they summarize it in one sentence, is that if you believe in fairness and equality, you are an unhuman that must be crushed. Now, this book had two authors. One was a ghostwriter. He's been a ghostwriter in other books, but the primary writer was a guy named Jack Posobiec. And Posobiec has long been identified in the Southern Poverty Law Center as a white supremacist and a neo-Nazi. They use both of those terms to describe him. And that goes back to 2004. So he's been around a long time. He's a longtime associate of Donald Trump's and works on one of the Trump-fed news outlets to this day. And this book, after they make this statement, they go into praising white Russians in the Civil War and in Russia in late 1910s and 1920s, praising the White Russians, who were, of course, monarchists, and represented the landed aristocracy, and some nonsense like that. But then when they talk about how to combat unhumans, how to crush unhumans, they talk first about, maybe harassing them with legal harassment stuff and so forth. But the centerpiece of the book says that there are historic models of leaders who have crushed inhumans. And they start with Francisco Franco. And as some will remember, Francisco Franco was a general of the Spanish army who overthrew the elected government of Spain in 1936 and started the Spanish Civil War, and proceeded with the help of Adolf Hitler in doing aerial bombardment of cities, the first time in Europe that had ever happened, and the aid of Mussolini, the Axis powers, and he bombed and mass murdered the opposition that supported the Spanish Republic that he overthrew, and created a dictatorship that held in place, I believe, at least into the 1990s. It might have been later than that, but then they say, well, here's another model. Augusto Pinochet, another general of the army. They like that theme, generals of the army, the Pentagon, overthrowing the elected government. And Pinochet, again, does a roundup of his opposition and conducts mass murder. And they even praise how he threw, quote, unhumans, unquote, out of helicopters. They said they pioneered it, and I don't think that's quite true, but that's gives you an idea of the mentality. And to make the point clear on the question of race, they say another person who did a great job of crushing unhumans was Ian Smith, less well known. Ian Smith was the premier of Rhodesia after it was separated from the British Empire. And the Black majority population said, we're no longer British subjects. We want equal rights in Rhodesia. And Ian Smith said, absolutely not. Organized the army and started killing blacks who demanded an end to apartheid. And eventually those black forces turned into, armed forces. And they say they praise the high kill ratios of Ian Smith had of his army versus the Black liberation fighters. They said he killed 50 blacks for every soldier that he lost. So they see all these three as models. They have a couple others, but I won't go on about it. But all of them conducted mass murder of the population. And so this book is praising it. At the very end, they say, now we don't advocate violence, but excuse me, you just did dozens of pages advocating violence. You advocated mass murder. So this book, the reason I'm pointing it out is this book was co-published by Steve Bannon, who wrote the foreword to the book. It was endorsed also by Bannon, but also by J.D. Vance, the vice president, and Donald Trump Jr., and Michael Flynn, the retired general that I just referred to as doing the sniper training school, and Tucker Carlson. So all these folks were the endorser of this concept of mass murder, and and what that tells us is that this is the inner core of Trump world advocating for this. Now, it's consistent with Trump because we know he ordered the troops to shoot George Floyd protesters in 2020. If you take his claims that he can establish law, he said in this 2024 campaign, after a Supreme Court decision was made, that he has the right to kill his opponents. He said this during his campaign, and it's like nobody got there was no big uproar about it. He said that he could declare martial law. All of the key points he said he would do during his 24 campaign, and the Democrats did not elevate that as an issue, and the media by and large bypassed it. Even his 70 people who worked in his first term White House signed a letter saying that he was unfit to be president of the United States. And that included his former chief of staff and his former secretary of defense.
And Marco, as we know, got rid of the South African ambassador.
Mhm.
And he also, Trump has said he wants to bring Afrikaners to the United States because they've been discriminated against in South Africa.
Yeah. I think he got a push on that from Elon Musk, who's, of course, was raised in apartheid South Africa and is still an apartheid adherent. And his family was exploited the apartheid labor force for their own personal wealth. So, and as we know, when Elon Musk did his Nazi salutes and said he was going to fund the AfD in Germany, which is the emerging neo-Nazi party of Germany, and also Nigel Farage in England, nobody put a break on that. Nobody said stop talking that stuff. He kept talking it, and those parties rose. And now Nigel Farage was in the single digits in England, and the recent municipal elections, they had a vast turnaround, and they had a mass victory in the municipal elections of England just last week. And so we have this emerging across Europe, and Vance and Musk and others are in the forefront telling European countries to not block President Trump's alliance. These parties that you're calling on the fringe, that where you've got firewalls, like the conservatives and the social democrats in Germany said, the AfD is too far out. We're going to have a firewall. We'll never allow them to come into government as a coalition partner. So unless they win over 50% of the vote outright, the AfD would not actually exercise power in Germany. But there is some erosion of that going on. There's a struggle even within the Conservative Party, because they're working with them on budget issues and some other issues that they share priorities on, even though there's supposed to be a firewall there. But on the other hand, the state security apparatus labeled the AfD an extremist party. And by German standards, and this is an open fact, if you're labeled an extremist party, you're subject to complete surveillance, including electronic surveillance. So any calls they have coming from the United States or US politicians or anything would all be intercepted by the state security apparatus, which is obviously opposing the AfD, which is interesting in Germany. So, but Trump world is trying to expand worldwide. And Trump even told Atlantic Magazine, I rule the United States and I rule the world. Of course, his tariffs were put out there not to sound economic policy by any standard, but to start telling nations, you have to come to me and start negotiating. It was an exercise of power and dictation to all the nations of the planet. And Romania, there's just a development there where a pro-Trump party is increasing its chances of taking over the country of Romania, because the more mainstream party leadership resigned. And Italy is ruled by a fascist party. Meloni is a fascist. Her party is fascist party. That goes back to Berlusconi when he was prime minister. He was an apologist for Mussolini and the origins of fascism. And then we have Austria, which has right-wing fascist parties not coming into government, but playing on, having a national stage. I think it's called the Austrian Freedom Party, but it's obviously not freedom for anybody but themselves.
And another person that Trump has put into a government position is David Sachs, who's been in charge of crypto and also the use of AI in the government.
Mhm.
And David Sachs, of course, is a crypto speculator and also is aligned with Trump and Musk and Vance. There was a benefit held at his mansion in San Francisco
Mhm.
for Trump where J.D. Vance was. Why don't you talk about David Sachs and his role in this fascist movement?
Well, I'm not as well informed on him, but when the way that you just summarized it, I think is very important because the uh, uh, a guy who studied the philosophy of these, if we can call it that, the outlook of the Elon Musk and the tech world in connection with uh, the role that they're playing now, where they're rewiring the social security system. And people should need to be reminded that there's no waste, fraud, abuse investigation. Those are accountants that do that kind of work, CPAs. They're doing programmers to rewire it. They're trying to create a new system with a new currency. Cryptocurrency will be, they don't imagine the United States as we know it continuing to exist. And this is Peter Thiel, the guy who set up PayPal, and um, and Elon Musk in particular. Uh, and Peter Thiel, by the way, is the guy who owns J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is a creature of the Peter Thiel machine. And so these folks basically are trying to create a new type of society of a smaller nature, and in which there is no quote freedom and democracy. They basically assert that the notion of democracy is antithetical to a better society, and that the people with wealth and prosperity and technology need to make the decisions and rule the society, and people can become citizens through contract. But but that doesn't mean as citizens that they are have any rights to exercise power or speak. There's no elections. There's just just a wealth-born society. Michael Brock a while back did a essay putting together the discussions coming from the apologists for this movement, and putting together how they imagine that they're going to restructure society. So the rewiring of the government, the rewiring of the assets, the dismantling of federal entities like the postal system, Medicare, and education and all that, to break it down so that in the new forms of society that they imagine that they're going to create. And I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm just saying this is their vision of what should happen. That they can break down, break away all these functions so there's no interdependency, and they have autonomous authority. It's
And isn't that part of Project 2025?
yes, and I think most of it is. Project 2025 is basically a program for fascism in the United States, and for folks who are used to seeing the term conservative associated with the Heritage Foundation, it's never been conservative. Classical conservative is breaking away from Trump, and it has been breaking away for some time. And I'm talking about even like the William Buckley type of conservatives that were considered the hard right during the Nixon years and the Ford years in the 1970s and 80s. George Will, syndicated columnist, and so forth. He resigned from the Republican Party when Trump was elected in his first term. So anyways, Heritage Foundation is not conservative. Heritage Foundation is fascistic. And in one of my early books, I wrote 10 pages just on how the Coors Brewery family, which was associated with the John Birch Society at the time, the Coors Brewery family created the Heritage Foundation. And all the money and drive and push came from the Brewery family, which John Birchism was one of the early vehicles of fascism in the United States in the 60s and the 70s and so forth. So the Heritage Foundation, when it was formed, they started working with the Ku Klux Klan in West Virginia on a school textbook fight, when the school board tried to get rid of the very racist textbooks that they had at the time and bring it more in line with the rest of the country. The Klan fought them, and the Heritage Foundation joined the fight with the Klan. They had a guy on one of their policy boards named Roger Pearson, who was an open advocate of racial extermination. He organized in Europe. He was from England originally. He organized pagan Nazi rituals in the Teutoburger Forest of Germany, which has this old Nordic history, and tried to bring together all the hardcore proponents of Nazism. And he was associated with American Nazi formations. And one of his books, he wrote that it's the duty of superior races to exterminate inferior races. So that's not conservatism by any means. And he was on the Heritage Foundation board in the 1970s when it was formed in 73. He was on their board until the Washington Post did a big expose on Roger Pearson in 1978.
And there's the issue of what is called authoritarianism. Some people say it's authoritarianism, it's not fascism. What's the difference between authoritarianism and fascism?
Well, I think people are more accommodated to the word authoritarianism, but when I use the word fascism, I identify four elements. First, one man rule, and we can already see that through him issuing fiats and dictates, through executive orders where he doesn't have the legal power to do it, but he gets compliance because people bow to him. Lisa Murkowski, a Republican senator from Alaska, as you know, recently said in her hometown newspaper that basically the Senate is scared of Donald Trump, scared in terms of like feeling threatened by him. And I'm sure that some of that threatening message is being done through certain top aides of his who are tied into the militias and so forth, who run the militia side of the Trump base. People possibly like Steve Bannon. And, when Joni Ernst, actually military veteran, who is the Republican senator from Iowa, said she would not vote for Peter Hegseth because of his extreme views. They threatened her. They organized actions in Iowa. They ran ads, and they told her she would be primaried in 2026 if she did not get into line and so she wound up voting for Trump, even though for Hegseth. And so that's the methodology that they know will happen to them if they buck Trump. So there's one man rule. That's part one. Two is that it represents basically as a faction, not all of, but a faction of a leading edge faction of capitalism. And with Mussolini, as he established fascism, industrialists were the vanguard. From the landed aristocracy, the new merging economic elite was the industrialists, and the industrialists formed a body council that worked with the fascist party to suppress labor organizing, farmer co-ops, and so forth. And that leads to the third part of what fascism is. It's street terror. Authoritarianism may be it may not have militarized forces on the street. When you think of authoritarians, just people who are habituated to one-man rule and don't tolerate much dissent, but they don't necessarily want to go out and shoot and kill people, perhaps. But fascists do. And so, again, you have one-man rule. You have in the U.S. economy, the vanguard is the technological elite.
The techno-fascist.
That's right, the techno-fascists. And you don't see so much and a sector of finance that's related to that. But you don't see the general Wall Street crowd, embracing the repudiation of democracy. But you see it in the techno-fascist world. Again, Peter Thiel, many others too, and Elon Musk, and the politicians that they own, like again J.D. Vance and so many others, and so and the fourth element is a mass appeal. Most authoritarians, when you think of monarchs and kings, they never had mass appeal. They had mass submission, but they didn't have mass appeal. The fascists organized by organizing a fascist party using a highly chauvinistic version of Italian nationalism and so forth, organized a pseudo patriotic base, and that's what the militias are, and the MAGA movement. That's the base, and some of it is the extreme Christian right, Christo-fascist, my pastoral friends call it, and Christo-fascist with the militias, and that is something that's specific to a fascist regime. And so to use the word authoritarianism dilutes the threat of what Trump really is, which is clearly a fascist. And let's face it, for years, he has talked of his not in public necessarily, but it comes out of accounts he's had over many years where he talked about Hitler did good things. He condemned the American troops who, as suckers and liars that died fighting Hitler. They're suckers and losers because they shouldn't have been fighting Hitler. And again, his chief of staff from his first term and his Secretary of Defense, both of them were retired generals, and they were serving in these other capacities for Trump. They both said in 2024 that Trump praised Hitler and said he wanted more generals like Hitler. And he wasn't happy with his American generals. So Peter Hegseth will give him more generals like Hitler. I don't think there's that many generals in the military that idolized Hitler or fascism like that. Although the nature of the system makes you kind of authoritarian because of the command and control. But any rate, the four elements of fascism are present and being exercised and being prepared for, with Musk taking economic sectors out of the federal system and creating them for a new type of society, with the Pentagon and others creating a whiter military force for street action, and getting rid of any obstacles that stand in the way of doing street action. So, the biggest remaining question is, when does Trump plan to do this? And I believe when they, going back to our earlier conversation, when they increase the capacity for incarceration beyond what they have now, I think, and I don't know what naturally none of us know what their standard is for enough incarceration, because, in some cases, people aren't going to be alive.
Well, one of the people also that he's brought into the government, Pam Bondi, he's brought in people from Florida, these right-wingers, fascist, and Pam Bondi apparently was Dominionist. Why don't you talk about the Dominionist? She's with the Apostolic Reformation Dominionist, and her role politically and ideologically in the Justice Department.
Sure. Yeah. Dominion theology has uh, several variations, but the Reconstructions we talked about earlier, they're the most hard line. Those are the folks that believe that the Constitution has to be converted or abandoned or destroyed in favor of some model of theocracy. And you know, true to traditional sectarianism, different Reconstructionists have different models. They all think that they're going to be the Polk of Protestantism of some sort, and so that's one version of. But there's you know, it's not just these hardcore sects, you know, that is SECTS. It's not them alone. You know, there's large ministries that have operated over years, focus on the family was Christian Reconstructionist of one version. And other major preachers, Pat Robertson's Regent University, the idea of regent is somewhat in the biblical terms is basically somebody who serves until the time that the second coming of Christ, right? And so the term Regent University itself embeds the idea of a Reconstructionist theocratic society. And you may know that when they organized the Christian coalitions in this, now we're going back to the antecedents here a bit of the MAGA world. The Christian coalition was in Louisiana, for instance, was backing David Duke, the most foremost Ku Klux Klan leader in the United States. And it's my understanding from some of the research that myself and others were doing back then that the Christian coalition, again, a Pat Robertson entity, was providing cover for mobilizing Klan forces, Ku Klux Klan forces, and the racist forces in the South, Texas and Louisiana and other states. So these were folks putting the building blocks together. The Promise Keepers later came. They were total dominionists. They wanted it, and I interviewed the pastor for the guy, Bill McCartney, who organized all this. He came out of a Catholic, pseudo-Catholic religious cult that practiced the dominionism. Yeah, and they said that they were creating a men's movement to sweep power across the United States and basically to overthrow the system and create a biblical model of government, which means, of course, a theocracy. So all these movements were the dominionist foundations for building the MAGA movement that we have today. And like I said, Doug Wilson is part of that, George Grant and others. They all come together, and I shouldn't have neglected this subject, but they have an entity where the big funders and the major organizing leaders come together called the Council for National Policy. And it's a completely secret organization. It started in 1981 by the Reaganites. And it brought together the big money people again. This would be Coors, the Hunt brothers, Texas oil money, and the leaders like Paul Weyrich and Pat Robertson, D. James Kennedy, another dominionist out of Florida, and many others. About three or 400 of these people. The DeVos family from Western Michigan was part of it. And this is where the money came together with the activists. Instead of every activist going out on their own and using fundraising appeals and not working together, but competing to get that money out there through direct mail, the donors came in and said, we're basically going to lay down the law, and, you know, we're going to set the agenda. And it brought a lot more unity into the new right and a lot more money into the new right. And that's where the foundation began. They kept the membership absolutely secret. They said no member can ever make any public reference to the Council for National Policy. Nobody can ever talk about any other members of the council. And when Donald Trump addressed this body, the pictures of all the attendees were pixelated, and they kept it down low. They didn't want the fact that Trump even met with them to be known to the public, but it was. They've been a little unsuccessful. I have some of their membership lists that were secreted out of the group over the past years. I don't have anything recent, but the Council for National Policy is a guiding force for all of what we're seeing now.
And the other issue is, of course, Zionism and the genocide that's now going on in Gaza.
Yes.
The U.S. government is actively supporting the genocide, and the ideology of Zionism. Isn't that a fascist ideology?
Well, I think Israel is proving that it is, and they would say that they're not fascist in so far as they have a Knesset and are elected. It's a fascistic foreign affairs. Whether you say that the different parties, there's different parties in the Knesset, and there's people who disagree with. There's demonstrations in Israel, but they get very little attention of Israelis who are against the war. And there's more resistance to the Israeli draft going on, and reservists are refusing to report to duty. So to some degree, they're allowing the Israeli citizens to have some limited rights, although they're cracking down on them as well. But when it comes to those Palestinians who've occupied that land for millennia, it's clear they are not seen as people who have a right to exist. Their extermination, it's genocidal, straight up. And the problem in this is, is that this is so pervasive that this has dominated the Democratic Party to one degree or another. They were, when Joe Biden was still president, there were 40,000 people who had been massacred by massive bombings, and he was given 5,000-pound bombs. You don't fight an underground organization with 5,000-pound bombs, and just allowing the massive destruction with leaking to the press that we've had little whispered conversations about our concerns about the mass killings and so forth. But it was all, when they had the Democratic Convention, the Palestinian voice was not allowed to speak at all, not even to hear one word that was at variance with what Joe Biden had been doing. And the campus suppression, in our area universities, one of them, just take one in Detroit, for instance, Wayne State University. When protesters came to speak at the governing board's meeting, the police asked them to go out in the hallway. And when they went out in the hallway, they picked every one of them up and slammed their bodies to the floor and beat the hell out of them. That was when Joe Biden was president. And that happened at the University of Michigan, and it was happening at campuses all over the country. Violence against the protesters.
And the issue of Zionism relationship with U.S. imperialism, U.S. government. During the 30s, the Zionists invited Adolf Eichmann to Palestine at that time to
Yes.
get the Nazis to support the formation of a Jewish state. And they had a similar ideology that Germans belonged in Germany and Jews belonged in what would be the new state that they wanted to have.
That's right. And I'm blanking on the guy who was like the principal leader of the Zionist efforts in connection with Germany. But they were negotiating with the Nazis, and there was a faction in the Nazi party say, yeah, we can get rid of all the Jews by just deporting them. And then, of course, there was the others, who did. We know what they did. They had been so influenced and consumed by their own propaganda that they couldn't resist the temptation of mass extermination. They, you know, and and this went back to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a fictional 1903 document that was created and used by the White Russians. And the White Russians that fled the Bolshevik Revolution brought it to Munich, and they started working, and they actually created joint organizations with the Nazi Party, Aufbau and some others, that worked, and they indoctrinated the German Nazis on the protocols. And that was the origins of the deepest anti-Semitism of Germany of that time, and it came to the United States through Henry Ford as well. And Boris Brazel was a White Russian that came to the United States and hooked up with Henry Ford, who was born an anti-Semite and was a deeply indoctrinated in it. And he's the one that got it translated into English, the protocols, and had it spread all over. Anybody who was a Ford dealer had to also disseminate the Ford's version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion to deepen anti-Semitism. And they worked with Nazi Germany. And Henry Ford got an award from Nazi Germany. He was the only American praised in Mein Kampf. Yeah.
And of course, General Motors also was making money during the Second World War, their factories. And in fact, they sued the US government for insurance costs after the war,
Yeah.
damages.
Charles Hyam's book, Trading with the Enemy, documents through documents that remain classified for many years. Henry Ford offered in the middle of World War II, 1943, he offered to Germany to build armored car plants in occupied France for the German army. 1943. And, circling back a little to Mein Kampf and bring us back to today a bit, a lot of people missed. And again, this is another criticism of the Democratic Party that basically gave Donald Trump a free ride for all his many years. They, in 1990, Vanity Fair published an interview with Ivana Trump, his first wife, who was, of course, then divorced. And she said that Donald Trump's favorite reading, bedtime reading, was Hitler's collected speeches, which historians have called the second Mein Kampf, because he compiled these books. And she said that he had a nephew that when he would come to visit and they would come in the room together, they would do Heil Hitler and do the Nazi salute together. And then the writer said, it's not clear whether they were joking, but they only did it with the two of them, right? But they were so into it. And the writer of the interviewer of the Vanity Fair article said, I think she was trying to hint to me that maybe Donald Trump is a closet Nazi. But if you go back to his upbringing, he was raised by a Ku Klux Klan father, who played a leading role in the Klan, apparently, because in 1923, when the Ku Klux Klan was organized in New York City, they held some big event in Central Park, one of the major parks in New York. I don't know if it was Central Park. And the police told them to leave, and they wouldn't. And so they had a big battle. And Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father, was arrested for fighting New York City police, which is probably mainly Irish back then, and arrested and prosecuted. So he was hardcore Klan. And during Donald Trump and Fred Trump's control of the Trump empire of housing, when they had like 17,000 units of housing, they never allowed one black resident in their entire time that they controlled that housing. And Woody Guthrie, the old folk singer, even wrote a song about it called "Old Man Trump." And so this is how Donald Trump was raised. He's a Nazi, and he told generals that Hitler did good things. He said men who fought them were losers and suckers.
And the Democratic Party, a large number of their funders are Zionist. Adelson, the Adelson family.
Yes,
So
yeah,
you have these Zionists who are actually funding a fascist, a Nazi. Is
yeah,
that what's going on?
yeah, yeah. And he uses his pretense of suppressing the universities and shutting down the universities by claiming it's about anti-Semitism, uh, which is obviously so. It's a thinly veiled thing that thinks this is the way we can get away with shutting down these universities, because we want mega education. We don't want the Harvards and the Columbias and uh, the Berkeleys and so forth.
And J.D. Vance has actually said that that was the problem. A big problem was the university system in the United States. It
That's
was
right.
secular, and it was a university system that threatened their ideology and their control.
That's right. He glowingly praised Richard Nixon's quote that the professors are the enemy. The professors are the enemy. The professors are the enemy. Yeah, that was J.D. Vance. And I think he said that in 2022. He wasn't saying it out of loyalty to Trump. He was saying it out of loyalty to Peter Thiel.
And they're implementing this project, yet it seems the corporate media, for the most part, are not really going into the real history of fascism in the United States and the
Mhm.
where Trump came from and the fascist movement that's behind him.
Right. The mass media and the Democratic Party are completely failing to describe what's going on. Um, and I think I can speak to that, with from experience, because when I did the research on Peter Hegseth, I started in November, and I spent a lot of time looking at the podcasts, and the nature of his organization, his network, and some of his history and so forth. And I put together a fairly brief document that cited the podcasts and what he said on the podcast. And it said, here, the podcast was this title on this date. And if you go to minute 547, he said this. And I put 5 of these together, and I took them to the US Senate prior to his confirmation. And I talked with half of the US Senate offices. I hit all 3 buildings. And I did this because there was no email link. If you go to the U.S. Senate site, you think, "Oh, I'll get my email." There is none. There are none there, and when you call the offices, they wouldn't give you one. So I said, "To heck with this! I'm going to buy a ticket. I'm going to fly to town," and I rented a room for a couple of days, and I went and visited all these offices, and I did all of them in one day, because they're not going to let you sit there and talk 15 minutes usually. Well, they might in some cases. Some of them did. And then I went back the next day for follow-up to all those offices. And I did some Republicans that were expressing an independent perspective on this matter, and to the Democrats. And I said, if you spend 10 minutes looking at these podcasts, because I give you the exact time, and some of the passages are only a few minutes long. You spend 10 or 15 minutes researching this, you will hear it out of his own mouth. You can't take my word for it. I'm walking in, you don't know who I am. And if I were you, I wouldn't automatically take the word of me either. I said, but take it from their own mouth, see it on video, hear it all, and you'll get it. And I said, you would do a great service if you could speak to the Senate floor and tell people what you learned from it. And I had some narrative too as well about the background of the movement and the context of the movement he was operating in, and gave him citations on that, some written and some on other uh, 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 podcast shows. So, any rate, not one of them did anything with it. And all
So
they had to do was listen and see it for themselves and say, hey, this guy here expressly said he wants to overthrow the Constitution. How can he swear an oath of allegiance to a Constitution that he's trying to overthrow? That's all a Democrat had to say.
and the insurrectionists seems like they control Congress, they
Mhm.
control the executive, they control the Supreme Court, which ruled that Trump, if he declared that he was doing an official act, he could get away with it.
Yes.
And so you have an insurrectionist government. So are you concerned that Trump, especially with the growing anger and protest movement of veterans, students, teachers, workers, government workers, that they can't afford another election and that they will actually institute martial law, maybe using a Reichstag incident that they create to have martial law, say that we have to have martial law and create an incident to bring it about, maybe even a war with Iran and
Mhm.
try to impose a martial law situation?
Yeah, I'm very doubtful that there's going to be elections in 2026, and and that's the crutch that so many anti-Trump people have, saying, "Well," I said, "Oh, so we're going to wait 2 years to solve this," quote, solve it, and so Trump was even, you might recall, famously quoted in 2024, telling pastors, "You won't have to vote for me again," But he's at the same time saying he's going to run for a third term. He does not intend to step down, is what that third term talk is about. But and they're trying to figure out a way at the Heritage Foundation of so institutionalizing everything in this Trump period so that it will last, quote, 100 years, which of course it could be fanciful, but it depends on what kind of authoritarian system or fascist system gets put in place. And but I think banking on the elections is a bad bet, and we've got to. And I say this to people who are organizing events, protests to Trump based on issues. I said everything that's being done right now is in response to Trump, but we're not putting our own analysis forward. We're not raising a larger vision of what needs to be done. And I said, because if you're responding to your anger about Social Security, about deportations, all legitimate articles and all those subjects need to be raised, but that can't be the beginning and the end of the discussion. We have to start openly saying that the prospects of martial law are disturbing, and we're building a movement to defend justice and stop martial law. And you don't hear martial law coming out of very many organizations who are fighting Trump. You don't hear that discussed.
Well, there was recently May Day, and some unions, activists and other unions marched, the sheet metal workers and small delegation marched in Detroit against the arrest of their member,
Yes.
Rego Garcia. But
Yep.
in general, the unions and the trade union leadership are not talking about fascism.
That's correct. The in the march, I will also say, started in a period of fairly heavy rain, so our numbers were dampened, if you will. But we had about 600 people in that march, despite that weather problem. But the sheet metal workers have taken the lead. But as we organized in Detroit, the bricklayers, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, as well as the sheet metal workers, were supporting the organizing of May Day. And this is a far departure from the building trades of generations ago, of course. And then some rank and file groups of the United Auto Workers were there as well. The sheet metal workers were particularly touched by this because Garcia was an apprentice in the sheet metal trade. So the building trades, for those who don't know, the building trades all have union employer/employer joint apprenticeship programs, and so if depending on the trade, it's usually a 4 or a 5 year apprenticeship. The pipe trades are all 5 years, plumbers, pipe fitters, and so forth. And the IBW, I think, might be 5 years now for the electrical trade. And so he was an apprentice in their trade, so he was a union member, and they, to their complete commendation, they said, "We're not going to allow this to happen to our member," but they know it's about a bigger issue than their member. But they've used that as their organizing organizing focus. And so the International Union has gotten the locals all across the United States committed to that fight.
Well, Trump has eliminated the Davis-Bacon bill, which pays prevailing wages on federal jobs. They want to basically break down the union conditions, the union benefits. But also, you have in Detroit the UAW Solidarity Center. I understand that one of the districts, UAW, is having a rally in favor of trade war and the tariffs. This is Sean Fain, who said he was for solidarity with workers around the world.
Yeah, yeah.
Was there a delegation,
Yeah.
UAW? Did Sean Fain help build the May Day rally in Detroit?
It was mostly through a rank and file that was the base for Sean Fain's election. It's called UAWD, United Auto Workers for Democracy. And
Unite All Workers for Democracy, I think it's
yeah,
called.
I met with a number of them at that rally, but there is a split in attention. But when Trump came to suburb just north of Detroit, after visiting a military base, Air National Guard military base there, he went to the community college to hold a rally, which he's done before when he campaigned, and the protesters. And this is in a county that voted for Trump. Okay, they voted for Obama twice, and then they voted for Trump twice because they were so angry at Hillary Clinton. They didn't like Hillary Clinton because of her free trade NAFTA stuff in Asia Pacific, expanding NAFTA into Asia Pacific region. So they voted for Trump because he said he was against it, NAFTA, and he was going to take down NAFTA, which he did not do. And any rate, the protesters there outnumbered the attendees to the Trump rally, and they were more spirited. Sometimes they laughed at Trump. It wasn't because he was telling a joke; it's because he said something stupid, and so they laughed at him. And these were his supporters. But the people out there got there early, and they stayed out there for 5 hours on the main avenues, rallying about 2,500 strong. So we believe some of the. I've gone to every anti-Trump thing going on, from the Canadian solidarity, these cross-border. And by the way, that's going to expand in the next planned rallies. And I don't remember the dates, I'm sorry to say. From Maine all the way to Alaska, there's going to be border actions on both sides of the borders, that 10 states and 8 provinces, to including the Yukon territories, to show solidarity against Trump with Canada. And I know they were planning to do a similar thing on the Mexican border, and I don't know how that's developing, because there's probably so much repression going on there. If people demonstrate, the ICE will be there to take them all up. So I'm not sure that's going to proceed.
Why would Sean O'Brien? Well, you have Sean Fain supporting Trump, the trade war, and Sean O'Brien, who went to Mar-a-Lago and invited Trump to have a press conference at the Teamster headquarters, attacking immigrant workers. And there are a large number of Teamsters who are immigrants.
Well, Sean Fain certainly didn't back anything, because he was constantly and vocally criticizing Trump. What he did is he endorsed one thing: tariffs that he thought would bring back more auto industry plants and jobs back to the United States. Now, that is from Mexico and from Canada, as well as from against the Asian and European competitors to the American manufacturers. So he was looking at it in the historic narrower pattern of trade unionism rather than its more global meaning. And so there was a big split in the UAW on that posture, by the way. That wasn't something that was universally agreed by the entire leadership, as I understand it.
But isn't this a capitulation to nationalism? I mean, you had today,
Yes.
Trump met with the Prime Minister of Canada, and in the press conference, he was saying, we don't need any cars from Canada. We don't need any steel. We don't need any aluminum. We're going to produce all of that ourselves.
Right. I think I completely disagreed with him. My approach has always been that if as capital goes international, the trade union goes international. So you organize the UAW in Mexico. The Canadians and the U.S. auto workers were one union back in the day, from the days of Ruther and Doug Fraser and others. And then the Canadians decided to split off and form their own union, which I think was unfortunate. But at any rate, and the Canadian Auto Workers Union, it's called Unifor, is very unhappy with the UAW.
But isn't nationalism part of the ideology of fascism?
It's, yeah, the most chauvinistic versions of it. It is. You can't, that's why I say, you've got to think international when you're a union. You can't think provincially. You can't think in the terms of nationalism when everything and the prospects of organizing is to go international too. And even with the European unions, there was some cooperation through what was then called the International Metal Workers Federation. So steel workers and auto workers and industrial unions worked with their colleagues in Europe, but they never tried to go international either. So I think they've hamstrung themselves by doing this, and it's not a credit to their success. But another part of the UAW doesn't accept what Sean Fang did.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much, Russ. We've been talking with Russ Bellant. He has spent decades doing research on the rise of fascism in the United States, who these fascists are, and studying the new government of Trump and the fascists that Trump has placed in that government, and why there's a danger of a martial law being imposed and a Reichstag incident and the shutdown of any kind of democratic rights in the United States. So thanks for joining us on WorkWeek.
It's an honor to be with you, Steve. Thank you. I'm there anytime you need me.
Very good. So one of the issues of Project 2025 that it talks about is the destruction of the trade union movement. Why don't you talk about his action against federal workers, basically revoking their union contracts, and how that's tied up to a fascist agenda and also Project 2025?
Yes. Federal workers are organized through a number of unions: the Postal Workers Union, and the National Association of Letter Carriers, and obviously both of those are specific to the post office, and then also the American Federation of Government Employees, and that covers like the Veterans Administration and many other agencies. There's 800,000 members, if I remember right, of the AFGE, American Federation of Government Employees, and they're not allowed to strike. So they don't have striking power, so they have to bargain with the assumption that there's some good faith on the other side, right? The government side, and so Trump ordered all the federal departments to discontinue bargaining and recognizing the union. He didn't arrest anybody yet, at least, but without their ability to strike, they don't have any other, and their agencies being told to not talk to them. That basically puts them on a very marginalized situation. So they discontinued the union dues deductions also, so that the unions would slowly lose their treasury. The other thing he did, however, that goes beyond federal workers is he quote fired a member of the National Labor Relations Board. The National Labor Relations Board is 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and so he fired one of the Democrats, which he really doesn't have the authority to do. But the National Labor Board said, well, right now we're frozen. We can't do any business because it's 2 versus 2. And so we don't have majority. We can't make majority decisions. And of course, the National Labor Relations Board targets unfair labor practices and illegal labor practices of employers, mostly in situations where unions are trying to organize. You know, at Amazon, Jeff Bezos is very happy to see the unions where he can run over the unions and do illegal things, and there's no labor relations board to stop him. Possibly a federal court, but maybe not. But that could take forever. And so seeing the crippling of the labor relations board is Starbucks, Amazon, and more of the new economy is strongly resisting labor, and these are also the people that contribute to Trump, a lot of money to Trump. So he's benefiting from disabling the capacity of workers to organize in the new sectors of the economy.
And wasn't that what Hitler did in smashing the unions? I mean, there were union officials that wanted to work with Hitler, and he basically put them in jail and destroyed the unions there. And it sounds like that's the agenda of Trump.
Yes, Hitler actually had a meeting with leaders of union labor in Germany when he took power, and it was all friendly, nice talk, and all this stuff. And the next day, they were arrested and swept away and disappeared from the scene forever, as I recall from my reading of history.
And do you think that that's possible today?
I think. I'm not sure whether that's possible, but I do believe that they could do mass arrests, and say these labor leaders are trying to create disruptions and they're trying to sabotage the economy, just manufacture some BS and shut them down, impose arrests, add them to the deportees, put them in Alcatraz,
And you think the unions are prepared for that?
No, I don't think they see that coming, but I think they see I think they see what Project 2025 says, and they see what Trump's actions, banning the federal unions, cutting the labor relations board, and they know that Trump intends to be aggressive. They don't think that's the end of it. They think it's going to get worse. And abolishing the Labor Relations Act is what I think they're afraid of. And so whether they see it any worse than that, I don't know. But ending the Labor Relations Act is going to end the legalization of organized labor.
Well, they trying to organize in the South all these auto plants,
Yeah,
non-union auto plants, millions of workers who want to join unions. Of course, Amazon, the Teamsters said that they wanted to organize them, relying on the NLRB and government agencies. It looks like is going to be impossible to organize these workers. And that
that's right.
means maybe going back to the 30s when workers had mass
Mhm.
mobilizations, thousands of workers surrounded plants, and there were general strikes that brought about unionization. Do you see that happening today in the United States?
Yeah, I think with the incapacitation of the Labor Relations Board, the employers will now violate the law and fire the union organizers on the shop floors and in the plants and so forth, and there will be no retribution. It's a violation of the law, but there's not going to be any enforcement of the law, so they'll do it.